Okay, hey everybody, we are going to be continuing working on Code Actually here, and I'm going to go to the Google Chart Examples page of Code Actually. At the very bottom, we started working on this another exercise project. And the first one that we did last time was we made a line chart that showed all zip codes, and that's what we see in our code here. And so I'm going to go ahead and pull that up and show you. This was the code that we had last time. A couple things that we need to make sure that we change on this is that these are not minutes that we're talking about. So I'm going to change that to dollars because this is either how much their home is worth or how much they make. And instead of element, I'm going to call this zip codes. And then I'm going to also change our title. Instead of weekly commute minutes, this is going to be median home value versus median income. Okay, so just to be a little bit more clear on this one. Now I'm going to go ahead and do a file save as charts. I'll save this one as line underscore chart because this is my line chart. And I can see that in my graph when I actually make it. It is a line chart, and that's what I'm going to basically save this one as. So line underscore chart is going to be the file name that I'm looking at. And so I'm going to save it just because I'm going to use it later. And I would suggest that you save this one the same way. Now, the next item on the list here in the another exercise is to make a column chart. So I'm going to go back into my code and do a file save as, and I'm going to save this as col chart so that I can start working on it in the format that we want to be using for this next challenge. So I'm going to go back to our class site here, and it says make a column chart that shows all zip codes and allows you to see what percentage of units can be owned by each of the groups, service, artist, and tech. Users should choose service, artist, and tech from the dropdown. So first, let's make sure that it's a column chart. And so let's go back to our code and go at the very bottom where it says line chart. We're going to change that to column chart. So right there alone is going to be pretty easy change. The next thing that it says on Code Actually is that we want service, artist, and tech to be the dropdown now. So as we go to the very bottom here, it was choosing between median home value and median income. We now want this to say service, artist, and tech. But we don't want to just change the option because we know that when the user makes a selection here, it's going to affect our variable. And so we have to figure out what exactly we want to access from our data. Well, we want to access home ownership amongst the service industry, home ownership among artists, and then home ownership among the tech sector. So these are the actual indexes that we're going to want to access and the values that we'll want to get. So own service, own artist, and own tech is what we're trying to access. So that's what needs to be here. We need own service to be here. We need own artist to be here. And then we need own tech to be here so that when they make the choice, it can find that value within our data. So basically what's going to happen now is the user going to make a selection, say they selected artist. Well, then basically what's going to happen here in our variable, it's going to go down to the dropdown, get the value, and say it was artist. So now selection is own artist. And then it's going to go into our info data, and it's going to say if selection at any point equals info I dot measure. Okay, so it's going to still access these measure keys. Instead of looking for median income, median home val, it's going to look for own service, own artist, or own tech. And then it's going to take each of these zip codes and assign those numbers to each of these variables. And then it's going to go push it to our table. And these are now no longer going to be dollars, but these are going to be percentages of ownership amongst these groups. And then we're not really doing home value and median income. We're doing home ownership, and I'll just call it that. And that's pretty much it. So I'm going to go ahead and save it and I will take a look at what this looks like in a browser, and I'm going to refresh it. And I want col chart, not line chart. And it worked, even though it doesn't look the best. So there's a couple things I need to do this table. One is that the table's messing up because our line chart div that it's being pushed into is really tiny. So I'm going to go ahead and go into our head and make a new style code and just say if it sees the div of line chart, then make it a height of, let's say, 400 pixels. And then I'll close my style tag. And then once you do that, and there we go. And now as I select like the text sector, now this has a higher percentage, so now I can see them when I hover over them that it did work. It assigned all those variables and it's working. All right, so the next thing that we want to do is it says make a column chart that shows all zip codes, allows you to see what percentage of units can be rented by each of the groups, So we have to look back at our code and we have to figure out how would we think about, instead of allowing them to choose what's being owned, but now we get to choose what's being rented. Well, up in our data, we've got both own service, own artist, and own tech, but we also have rent service, rent artist, and rent tech. So the way to switch it would be that I would have to go down to my selections, and instead of accessing own service, it's going to select rent service. Instead of own artist, it would be rent artist, and instead of own tech, it'd be rent tech. Now, I would also make sure that I would want to change that here, and instead of home ownership, it's going to be home rental percentages. And now I can go back into my chart, refresh it, and see these data here. So if I look in the tech sector, really large numbers of people can, now this is scaled weird, so it's going from 88 to 100%. So we're really only seeing the tips of these. And so that's why 99 is so high and 890 looks so low. So the next thing that we're going to look at is we want to make one column chart that shows both own and rent on the same chart. Each zip code will display two columns instead of one. So we've experimented with this a little bit with other examples where we have two different bars on one chart, and that's what we're going to do now. Is we're going to think about how we might access both of them on the same chart. So basically what's going to happen is when the user goes to select something, it's not only going to select the rent service, but it's also going to assign the ownership as well. So I'm going to change these back to own, and I'll tell you why in a second, why I'm changing this back to own. So that when the user makes a selection, not only is it going to assign all of the, say they chose service. Well, it would go find own service and it would assign all the variables like it did before, all of these numbers. But before it's done, we also want it to jump to the next item, and we want it to assign these as well. So one way we have to do that is we have to think about what's happening when it's going into the info for that particular iterator, that number that it's in, and it also has to assign not just these, but it needs to go to the next item as well. So the way that we could do this is we could take all these zip codes, and we need to make some more variables to not just hold the first answer, but also the second one. And so the own numbers and then also the rent numbers. So I'm just going to name each of these new variables, Z1A, Z2A, and so on, just because it makes it easier to remember. And then in this case, instead of just going to info I dot, which I would be the number of which index it's on. So if it was on I is 0, this would be 0, this would be 1, this would be 2. In this moment, if they chose service, then I would be 0, 1, 2. It would be on 2. So how would we think about not just getting the 2 value, the second index, but getting the third one as well? Well, one way to do that is to not just assign info I dot, whatever number it was on, but also assign info I plus 1 every time. And so it's going to grab both it and the one after it. And that's why I chose own first, because it is going to not just assign the one that it's on, which is the own, but the one after it. If I chose down here, if I chose rent service, rent artist, rent tech, then I might have to do an I-1 every time because it's on rent tech. It couldn't go anywhere past that. It would have to go before it. So that's just one small thing that we have to think about. And so now when we go ahead and map it into Google, it's not just mapping percentages, but we're also adding another one, Z1A. Okay, so we can have multiple variables here within the Google chart itself. Now that we've made all of these new variables, we actually have to use them in our Google chart. So that's how we are going to display it all the way up to 9. And instead of percentage, we can also add another one that says percentage rent and percentage own. So now we've set this up to be both percentages, which would be the Z values, and then the percentage rents, which are the Z1As, and these over here. So hopefully you can see that it's not just assigning one variable every time, but it's also adding one, and it's going to the next one as well. So let's go ahead and save this and take a look at what it looks like in the browser. And there it is. So as we compare these, we have 2 lines on each, and we can compare how much percent of each of these groups own versus rent. So the very last thing that it says here is combine the first and the last charts on one page. And so that's something that we had not spent a lot of time doing, but we kind of rushed through it last time. What I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and open up both of these in my text editor. I've got my call chart with the 2, and then I'm going to go ahead and open also my line chart so that way I have both of them open. And so what we talked about in class was that we've got to combine these into one file. And so the way we're going to do that is I think I'm going to move my line chart into the column chart. I'm going to go ahead and take my line chart and get it ready so that I can move it into the other one. First thing I'm going to do is, because this is a whole function called draw chart, it's going to be the same function as the function draw chart here. I don't want them to get confused. So I'm going to go into my line chart and call this whole thing draw chart 2. Okay. Now the problem with that is that up here when it's calling up the chart, it's still calling up draw chart. So I have to also change this to draw chart 2. So it's going to go ahead and call up the chart 2. It's going to load all of draw chart 2. So everything from here all the way down is going to be just fine. I don't have to do an options 2. I don't have to do new variables or anything because this is all part of the same function. It's not going to get confused. But it will get confused when it goes down to the form because I'm repeating the same form here as well. So that's where I would change this to form 2, draw chart 2, the drop down 2. And so then it's going to, now that I changed it here, I do have to change one more thing up in my JavaScript because here I'm accessing now the drop down 2 and not just the regular drop down. So those are the main things that you're going to have to change. Once you have it all changed to 2, the draw chart 2s, the drop down 2, and you've changed form 2 and all this kind of stuff here, another thing we have to think about is this line chart. So because I am moving this into a line chart, I will want this to match where it's going to push the item to. Now, because this is my line chart, I don't mind that this says line chart and it's going into the div of line chart. But over here in my column chart, I probably want to go ahead and change that. So I'm going to go back into my chart here, and instead of calling this line chart, I'm going to call it call chart. Now again, I'm in the call chart file. I'm going to change my ID to be call chart again. And then down here where it's going to go is it has to be call chart. Okay. So just that makes a lot more sense in when I actually merge these two together. So now that I have my line chart working, I'm going to go ahead and see if both of these work in my browser before I start merging them. So I'm going to go ahead and refresh. Now my col chart, it still works, even though I use the drop down to and all that kind of stuff. Now I've got to go ahead and see if my line chart works. So I'm going to go ahead and access that file as well. And yay, it does work. It's still working. So that's the first step, is to make sure both of these work independently of each other while after you've changed all of these to 2. Okay, if it doesn't work at this point, it will definitely not work when you push them together, because the final response does say that we do need to combine the first and last charts on the page, make necessary changes to the script to allow multiple charts to display. So I'm going to go back to my code, and I am going to basically move everything that is new. All right, so the first thing is draw chart 2. I'm going to copy that. I'm going to go way up here, and I'm going to paste it right below the other one so that they can load together. Now, the only function I have right now is draw chart, the first one, and that ends way down here on line 78. Now, I still want to be within the script code, right? I'm still within my JavaScript, so I want to go before that. Now, this bracket here is where my draw chart function ended. And I know that because I can put my cursor here on the end, and I can scroll way up, and the other underline is on that one. And so that's the cool thing about Sublime Text, is it lets me do that. I'm going to go ahead and grab my next function, everything from this line all the way down to line 68 for me. And again, I want to go ahead and copy that code, and I'm going to paste it right when my draw chart ends. And so for me, it's going to be around line 80 or 81. I'm going to paste all of my draw chart 2. Okay, so now I not only have my draw chart, but I have my draw chart 2 function. Then I'm going to want to go ahead and grab my form, my next form with its div, and I'm going to go ahead and copy that. And I'm going to paste that below my other form right after my column chart ends. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and file, save as. Might as well save this as both chart. That way I can always go back to my column if I really mess something up. Now let's go ahead and take a look at what this looks like in a browser. I'm going to go ahead and access both chart. And there we go. They both work independently, they both work separately, and they both are 2 different charts. And so that is how it's supposed to look, that you have 2 different charts working on the same page. And I hope that's a quick refresher on how to make 2 charts work on one page. In the next video, I'm going to show you guys how to take data and start moving them into charts like this. And so hopefully you guys can get both of these charts working on the same page this week.